Hi, everyone. Well, welcome to our Women in Green Tech initiative and to our webinar. So welcome all our listeners and our panel. My name is Iona. I head up Storm4 here, and we're thrilled to announce the launch of our Women in Green Tech initiative. So this program aims to provide a supportive platform for women in the sustainable technology industry to come together, to create a dialogue, share their experiences, and offer a mentorship. Sorry. Storm4's Women in Green Tech initiative will bring together the sector's inspiring figures in an online network where they can collaborate and discuss both business and personal challenges while sharing their unique journeys and perspectives. Sorry. In this series, the female founders who are both creating the technology needed to address climate and those helping drive sustainability and finance will take their center stage. These role models inspire us to keep creating and supporting climate initiative and innovation and spur on the positive feedback cycle for other climate-focused women. In addition to the webinar, the Women in Green Tech initiative will also include a series of events and mentorship programs. Storm4 is excited to see the impact this initiative will take in our place in Asia-Pac, but also is committed to promoting and supporting women in the industry for years to come. So thank you so much for coming. I'm super excited to have you guys here. Thank you all for taking the time to be part of this amazing initiative for the future. I am heading up Storm4. Storm4 was established in 2020. We were basically launched to really help facilitate the growth in the green tech space, partnering with startups, scale-ups, and beyond in helping them scale in senior level talent. We've been through our Series A funding. I know quite a few people on this panel and people listening will be part of investment rounds, funding rounds, and partnering with companies at similar stages. So thank you very much. I would love to basically start with an introduction of everyone. Today we have a lineup of very, very inspiring women, and I will let them all introduce themselves. And yes, please could you all let us know as well how you got into the green tech space. Starting with Anandhi, please may you start. Thank you.
Thanks, Iona. So my name is Anandhi. I joined Emerald about a couple of years ago. Emerald is a clean tech venture capital firm, and we invest across energy, water, circular economy, and more broadly, industrial innovation. In fact, we were started by another very inspiring woman entrepreneur way back in 2000, way before climate tech even existed. My background is in renewables, so my journey with clean tech started soon after college, where I was very convinced that we needed to find solutions for climate change. I was growing up in India, and at the time, I grew up in a city which was pretty sleepy, but in front of my eyes, I saw lakes disappear. We had a huge, very prolonged drought, and that's when cloud seeding was being used. And that, of course, is today a very hotly debated topic. But cloud seeding was being used in order to promote rain. And I think all of these had very profound impacts on me. And that's why I chose to be in this sector, to find solutions. Yeah, maybe hand it over to my other colleague.
Thanks, Anandhi, and thanks, Iona, for having me. My name is Jayantika. I'm the founder and CTO of a company called Resync. I started this company 5 years ago with my co-founder, Amir. We primarily focus on intelligent energy management for the built space. So essentially, we make buildings more energy efficient, reduce their energy consumption somewhere up to 30%. My background has been power and energy for the last 13, 14 years. I did my undergrad in one of the IITs in India. And after that, I was actually working in an oil industry for 2 years. And within a year, I realized this is not something I want to do. This is not something I envision myself doing on a day-to-day basis, and made the pivot to move towards green tech industry. And that's where I moved to Singapore, got my PhD focusing on energy optimization with renewables in built environment, essentially. And then, it has been 10 years for me in green tech industry right now. So maybe I'll pass on to Leah now. Yeah.
Thanks, Jay. And great to see everyone, and very happy to be here today. So I'm with Terrascope, which was established 2 years ago. We're a startup that we serve an end-to-end decarbonization SaaS platform for companies. So we help companies measure their emissions and plan their journey to net zero through kind of the credible transition planning. So the platform automates some of the work that it takes to calculate emissions through machine learning and data science approaches. And on that net zero journey, it's about setting targets, developing scenarios, understanding your strategy, what's your transition risk. So we don't shy away from the hard stuff because we focus on supply chain emissions, so this scope 3 value chain. And it's really traditionally been hard to quantify emissions across the value chain, but that's where like the kind of climate green tech element comes in. And we also don't shy away from the hard stuff because we target real economy sectors. So our large multinational corporations are in agriculture, also kind of very hard to quantify traditionally, food and beverage, consumer retail, and technology companies. And in terms of geographic distribution, we have a lot in Singapore, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and kind of expansion. So where do I fit in? Head of sustainability in Terrascope. So I have both a subject matter expertise role in climate change and a leadership role as a woman in the kind of C-suite tier of the company. My personal journey to climate tech is short, 2 months, but what I bring is a lot of climate expertise. So like Anandhi, I got into this because I'm from a small island for personal reasons. So I'm from a small island, Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean. One of my earliest memories is a Category 5 hurricane. And so that's really been what has grounded me and why I do climate and kind of keep focused on that. So the career has taken me across the Caribbean, North America, Africa, and now Asia. And so this year I pivoted from a diplomatic career track, negotiating at the COPs and climate at the UN, into the kind of working with companies and in the private sector space. And then I've also pivoted regions. So I think one other thing to note is I've really valued having, especially in the pivot, but throughout these kind of key career milestones, having women-only spaces, people who get it and mentor and share those insights. And I went to an undergrad that was actually women only. So I've always valued the support that female groups lend in career progression. So that's it for me. I'll hand over to Sumira.
Thanks, Leah. Hi, guys. My name is Sumira, and I work at a company called Wavemaker Impact. And what we aim to do is basically co-found and launch the next generation of climate tech companies with the eventual aim and the eventual goal of abating 10% of the world's carbon budget. In terms of my professional journey and how I came into climate, I actually started off more from a strategy sort of startup corporate finance background across Canada, where I went to university, as well as Malaysia, where I lived and grew up. In 2018, I got an opportunity to sort of take those skills and take them into sort of the real world and starting to build businesses and launch the digital department of a listed Malaysian entity. And I think during that time is where I really found my passion for starting and launching businesses, right? 2 years later, I grew the team to 10 people, launched 2 successful businesses, but was really struck by the question of, I know I love what I'm doing, but why am I doing what I'm doing? And I think this is when I sort of came across Wavemaker Impact. And I saw this really as the perfect blend of, my skills and passion for building new businesses, but also joining that with a cause that was worthwhile. And I think what was really compelling about the Wavemaker Impact mission is that I really realized that, like the esteemed colleagues sort of on this panel, everyone comes with a lot of technical expertise in renewables and across sustainability, but there are business model innovation problems that also need to be solved within climate, right? The reason there aren't solar panels on every roof across Southeast Asia is not because the technology doesn't work or it's not a proven income generating asset. It's because of incentives and business model, right? So I'm just very, very thrilled to be in the space and to try and solve problems from that business model lens, and super excited to be here and chat. So I'll pass it off to Wini.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Wini. I am the co-founder and COO of Aprisium. Aprisium is based here in Singapore, and we are in clean tech. So what we do is we basically provide really rapid on-site contaminant detection and monitoring services for companies who are in the water space, wastewater treatment, soil, or food or cosmetics. So basically anybody who wants to know what's going in and what's coming out of their processes. So we're there. And then we were born out of a accelerator program, a startup accelerator ran by the Singapore Deep Tech Alliance in 2021. And since then, we have been so passionate about helping governments and companies around the world solve their problems of areas of contamination concerns, helping to protect the public health and environmental safety and health as well. So that's what we do. And personally, how I got into it, I've always loved working in technology, and I've always had. And I want to do something that's for the betterment of people's lives. When we chanced upon this technology with my two other co-founders, we really want to make a difference in how contaminant detections are currently being done and try to reduce the amount of time so that things can be caught as soon as possible, and then prevent things like product recalls, production stoppages, environmental damages, basically. So that's where our passion is, and our mission. And personally, before moving back to Singapore in 2020, I was living in China for 6 years, and my daughter and I were actually victims of heavy metal poisoning. And it came from the water that we drank. Not that the water in China was dirty, but the pipes that delivered the water to our house, they were sold by lead. And of course, we found out the hard way, the impact of what lead can do to your body. And then, so I have a personal interest, right? In we can do something about this, right? So we been dealing with technology. We started off with heavy metal, and now we've moved on to other contaminants like VOCs, and now we're working on pesticides. And then eventually we hope to get to things that's quite hard, like hydrocarbons and even microplastics. So that keeps us busy. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was a really good insight into what everyone's done, and it's great to see such a diverse panel from so many different backgrounds as well. Although all working in the same space, it's great to see people from VC firms, technology firms, more traditional. It's really great to see that. So thank you so much. Moving on to our next question, which I think is a topic that has come up a lot, but really interested to hear everyone's opinion and kind of your experiences. Have you worked, or are you working in a male-dominated environment? And if so, what challenges have you faced as a woman in that environment, and how do you deal with them? I don't know who wants to start with this. If anyone is willing to kind of start it off, and then you can bounce ideas and conversations off each other, that would be great. Whoever wants to take the floor first.
Maybe I'll jump in. I have been in the energy industry. I studied engineering in India in one of the IITs. So being in male-dominated environment is all I know throughout my career progression. And I can possibly say that for the rest of the women on the panel, that it's not easy breaking barriers that we have in our industry. There are, of course, challenges that you face. Whether when I was in the oil industry, I was the only woman in the on the site, and there was no other female on ground. That was almost like 13 years ago. But things have evolved tremendously back in India as well as here in Singapore, where you see women leaders, you see women in decision-making position, women charting throughout the way. So there has been a lot of progress that has taken up over the last couple of years. A very quick example that happened in the early days of Resync, when we were just starting out. So we started our journey in renewables and providing energy management solution for microgrids per se, which are typically your kind of off-grid or on top of factories. You have a solar rooftop with a combination of diesel generators. So you have to work in a very rugged kind of environment where you're providing not just an IoT solution which works on the ground, but also a SaaS-based platform to the different stakeholders, whether it's the renewable asset owners, whether it's the site owners, so on and so forth. So I went down for the first installation along with my team. So, as startup founders are, they are like busy getting their hands dirty. So we were doing the installation. This was back in India on one of the rooftops. And it was like peak summer, like late July, really, really hot weather. And we were trying to make sure that we have taken care of all the safety aspects and the algorithms are working as expected. And when it was time to go, I was like, okay, we are done. And they were like, oh, can we speak to your manager who is supposed to guide us through the whole overall process? And I said, like, I am it. This is it. I will explain to you how it works and I'm sure everyone's laughing at this, and this is not unique. Like, everyone has asked to speak to someone above you who is like the decision maker, who knows the techie stuff, who knows the hardware stuff, or who knows the details about it. So this happened, and then I told them, I handed out my card that it says Dr. Jayantika Soni. So it was a very funny reaction. It was like, why are you doctor? I was like, I have a PhD. I created the solution from scratch. And so one way to take it is, I take it as a funny moment. Take it as like, it's okay. This was a teaching opportunity for them to learn that there are women out there right now who are willing to do the hard job, who are willing to make the decisions, and who will chart the way forward, right? So get used to it, that this is the equality is coming. So get used to that scenario. Yeah. So that's a story I had to share.
I was just reading an article last week about women in technology, because Women in Tech is coming up again, and so Grace Chung, a podcast journalist, she wrote that in Southeast Asia, in the tech industry, only 15% or less than 15% of the C-suite roles and board positions are held by women. So that's not a lot. And globally in tech, it's like 26.7% or something like that. So even though in Singapore, I think the statistic is a lot better, but still, right, if you look at my industry in particular, in clean tech, right? Clean tech is deep tech. Already women in tech is not that many. In deep tech, in a deep tech startup, it just gets smaller and smaller. I remember that when we first started the company, one of the questions one of the potential co-founders asked me is, do you have kids? Do you intend to have more kids? It seems like it has to be mutually exclusive, right? And then, of course, in deep tech, you do spend a lot of time in a startup as well, setting up the company, doing everything. It's very hands-on, very bootstrapped. It does require a lot of effort and a lot of time. And I can see why that is difficult, if the woman is still the primary caregiver. It is a big sacrifice, and I'm in a lucky position where I get a lot of support. So, and I think that it is a challenge that cannot be ignored. But on the plus side, I would say that being women in green tech, sustainability, and all, we have a lot of platform that support women in our position. There's a lot of people who wants to hear from you, and then when I walk into the room with investors and doing a pitch, they're interested, right? It sets us a little bit apart, and then I think so. It's definitely a lot of pros as well, other than the cons. So that's my take.
Amazing. I was just going to maybe ask Leah, I know you've previously had experience in the UN. I'm really intrigued by that. Have you had any experience, whether actually being in the UN or your external projects, kind of in those male-dominated environments? Do you have any kind of stories you could tell about your experiences with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you see a lot when the climate at the COP26, COP27, the COP negotiations, actually one of the gender kind of policy approaches is starting to look at the negotiators and the gender of negotiators that come together. And it's countries nominate their negotiators to participate in the COP. And so it's really out of the control of kind of the UN, but it's up to countries. But tracking it is really insightful, because what you see is at the kind of base level of the negotiators, it's relatively maybe like 40-60. So you get pretty good female representation. And to kind of the earlier points, there are some nonprofit groups. For example, one of my early COPs, I was trained by this women's group on how to do kind of the negotiations and navigate that space. And those kinds of things are really helpful, because then you're entering with just that kind of level of confidence. But what you see progressing up the chain is that the women definitely drop off a lot. And I think there's certainly an element, because it basically requires 2 months out of the year to be at the different meetings. So there's a huge amount of travel, and that it gets very hard to have family. And actually, I've been fortunate in my kind of previous government public sector roles to have really incredible female kind of our lead negotiator was a woman from the Caribbean. You get some really incredible female negotiators. But when she was making her own decision, she had to, for financial reasons, continue in the role, and she kind of pushed through the family, and then she went on to succeed in her career trajectory. But if you don't have that kind of imperative, if you have the option, it's really incredibly taxing. So I often feel like if you can solve for having a more like robust family, then you really solve for having a better lifestyle, whether you've got kids or whether you're the mother or the father or anybody. And so so that was a trend. And then when you saw to the elected official level, then yeah, the women very much have underrepresentation at the level of minister, for example, and then heads of state as well. So that's from kind of the governance participation of the COPs, and those metrics are tracked and encouraged, but it hasn't changed a huge amount over time at the higher levels. In the UN itself, one of my personal challenges was that I felt a lot of women kind of took on a lot of the extra roles about, bringing cohesion, having things run really well. And I didn't see that recognition being translated into progression up. So you saw a lot of like the kind of circles. So that was my own kind of personal experience and navigating that space. And I think it is possible, and I really admire the women who have pushed through and risen to that level. But you see a lot of the systemic biases and how that plays out in a very operational way across a huge system like the UN.
Thank you. Lastly, I was going to ask Sumira. I know, at Wavemaker, you're obviously trying to connect, co-founders, trying to establish these new businesses. I guess for you, from what you're seeing, from your perspective, are there lots of women that, want to take these co-founder statuses? If so, what kind of background do they come from? If not, why do you think that is? More of a general question, I guess, of kind of your observation on the market.
Absolutely. I think, just to build on Wini's answer as well, right? Like, I think if you look at female co-founders within startups in Southeast Asia alone, that's already a small group. When you look into tech, it's smaller. When you look into climate, it's even smaller, right? So frankly, it's an area that we are highly, highly focused on. Our model really is to build 100 by 100 companies, which are companies that have the ability to generate $100 million of revenue and also abate 100 megatons of carbon at the same time. So the next generation of climate unicorns. And our model for doing this really is to find an existing founder who is exited and sort of wants to build their next great thing in climate. And we take them on this process and help them co-found a business. And I think it is a struggle that we're facing to try and find sort of female founders who want to do this as well and who fit the bill. A lot of it has to do with timing, right? You have previous founders who have exited but are taking a break, or who have maybe another opportunity that they want to pursue, or so it's around a lot about finding the founder at that right moment. But it's definitely something that we're focused on, right? To try and it's specifically a pillar in our playbook to find more female founders to build this up. So I think it's via this platform, it's a call out to any sort of founders, male or female, but especially female. If this is something you're interested in, please get in contact. Absolutely.
Amazing. Yeah, hopefully this webinar and our platform and what you guys are doing will get the message out there to more people. But yeah, I think it's obviously a topic that I think needs to be talked about a lot more. But yeah, thank you so much for all of your answers on that. kind of leads us on to the next question. And I'd love to direct this to Jay, Leah, and Wini. What can startups do to better support and empower our female workers? So I guess, looking at that, looking at it a bit more further in depth, what kind of structures can they put together that can help kind of drive everyone in the same company mission? Leah, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to. So I think the opportunities of startups is building from the ground up, and the challenge of startup is probably building from the ground up, where so I think the opportunity is around really thinking kind of holistically, from starting with values and all the way kind of governance, leadership, metrics, support systems. And so like for Terrascope, one of the things that really drew me to the company was our female CEO, Maya Hari, and she is just a really incredible force for leadership and for decision making and for strategy and just on every metric. So I think having an anchor, high profile woman in there really does attract similar, like that's there. I think there's nothing that really can trade off for what that means. I'm sure like a kind of progressive male leadership could do the same, but I think for me that was really a factor in being attracted to Terrascope, and even kind of thinking the values. So we're kind of going through a value setting process at the moment, but I've enjoyed listening to and thinking about company values, and one of the phrases has stuck out for me, which is ambition with heart. And I feel like that really captures like setting a norm that's ambition and progression. We're solving a hard problem, ambition at a global climate level. And what does it mean to do it with heart, where you set, supporting and enabling environment internally in the culture of the company to make it sustainable, to internalize that principle throughout. So I think value and culture is super important. I think the governance is an interesting one. And so we have, the board is set based on finance, and but it's a male board. What we've done is we've set up actually all female advisory council on sustainability to have kind of gender balance at the governance level, and also for kind of the sustainability insight. They're really incredible anchors. One is a former UK minister for energy. Another one has worked in pharma Novartis for a long time. So the governance is really key, kind of thinking all the way through. And then the leadership. So I mentioned there's been a really intentional push to put women in key roles. And right now we have, I think, 43% female target KPI where we're at. But when you look into that, our head of engineering is a woman. Our product manager is female, our head of data science. So actually there's been an active trade-off. I know they waited for me longer than they would have liked, but they were really intentionally, the company has really intentionally sometimes traded off getting someone in there right away urgent for a candidate that is the right candidate no matter what, and also bring some of that diversity to the company. And the reason why for that push is really because it informs the decisions you make, how you work together as a team, that there's real payoffs for the outcome of that. And I think thinking also about support systems, really important, not just putting people there, but what is the formal and also the informal support systems around different roles. And I love our head of people. She's very excited about 𝗣𝗲𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗋 because it's a new software that does this HR, and it has all kinds of men. So for example, there's even pronouns instead of just male, female. And so thinking about diversity and how the software we use interacts with the company culture that it creates. And so I love that she got so excited about this new software. Formal support systems like training plans and upskilling, especially in the sustainability space where there's a lot more career opportunities than there are jobs. There's more jobs opening up than people that are entering the space. And then, setting kind of really intentional developmental goals. So that's the formal one. And then I think the informal things like encouraging, if someone is, having a hard time with joining the company, or is going through a shift, or wants to take, not even the downside, just the upside, like wants to take their career to the next level, looking at what's worked for me and how can I help kind of advise around coaching and getting that executive coaching support during key moments. Mentors and friends, like I mentioned, that like kind of having female-only groups that you can just be really real and vulnerable and think about the challenges and growth opportunities. That's such a tremendous support. And so I think the informal support systems as well. And so right kind of top to bottom, thinking holistically in my own role as a head of sustainability and hiring. So I do have, I'm thinking about decarbonization. I have a couple roles open and very much being aware of who I'm looking for, what I'm making sure you're kind of being systematic. And I think this is where the data-driven approaches really help, rather than the UN, where things are very subject to, in my view, bias, because you don't have those external metrics built into your system. So working with a lot of data scientists is wonderful when you're trying to kind of keep biases in check and look objectively at where you're going and what you're doing. So yeah, that's a little bit of my take on the sustainability vertical with kind of gender diversity.
Amazing. Jay, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think we are a fairly smaller team, like around 25 people, 5-year-old company. So we don't have a lot of hierarchies in place. It's relatively still flat at the moment, where what we believe is to create a good team which works together, which gels together. I think the values that Leah spoke about the culture and the cohesion in the team are some of the important things that drive us. Personally, for me, I think like we have been very lucky to be being blessed with a good team, and I have tried to drive my own personal value of creating an empathetic and respectful team across the organization. So it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, or you bring diversity to the table. I think creating those kindness attributes at the core of your business are really, really important, and tying them, of course, to the financial and the organization level goals are which brings this whole thing together. And we've been fairly successful in creating a safe environment for people where they are happy to voice their opinions, whether it's dissent, whether it's agreeing with the founders, whether agreeing with the direction of the company and how they can contribute to. So naturally itself in the team, we have had like people who have been working take up like a lot of leadership qualities and leadership roles, whether it's my product manager, whether it's our chief of people, whether it's inside our software engineering team. And I see this quality coming across not just our women in tech, like not just our women employees, but across our male employees, and making sure that difference of opinion or different perspective is brought to the table, right? So I think that's really, really important as we talk about diversity, not just women in tech, but also about like people coming from diverse backgrounds. So Resync, if you look at our team photo, it's like a hybrid photo of people from Indian descent, from the post-Soviet era countries, female founders who like myself, but also female leaders like Aisha, who's our chief HR, etc. And that's the quality that we look for even in our future employees, whether the cultural makeup or the cultural, I guess like the word that I look for in candidates is grit, that they have what it takes to push through, to figure out whatever is the solution or whatever is the initiative they would want to push towards, right? Like, and having those grit kind of qualities, women generally tend to have rank higher on those. Like that's what I've seen on the dozens of interviews that I've conducted over the last 5 years. But yeah, that definitely is something on our mind actively. We are also thinking about how we can model leadership qualities in our team as we grow, as we are currently in the growth stage and we are growing the company to a more significant level. So we have more leadership roles coming up, we have more positions coming up. In fact, like some of our business markets are being led by women, like our Thailand market is being headed by a woman who's based out of Bangkok. So yeah, there are different layers of it, not just the tech part, but the non-tech aspect are equally important and equally valuable in driving the success of a company.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lastly, Wini.
So our company is very small, but I would say all of us came from really big MNCs once upon a time. So we come from, companies that have proper structure when it comes to, hiring for diversity, gender equality, all the good things that, MNCs have for HR and staffing, right? So we try to inculcate as much as those values into our culture as possible. I would say that, when we talk about like feminine leadership, we talk about things like, communication, empathy, humility, dynamic relationship practices in business and all. I would say that I'm very fortunate that my two co-founders, they're male, they're men, and then they actually exhibit a lot of these qualities as well, right? So I think when we look for candidates, right now, our number one priority is basically somebody who is passionate about what we do, and wants to do it, and then motivated to work in a startup, right? Because it's a very high risk doing what we're doing. And then, so I think our quality that we want in a person, number one, is that dedication, right? So be it a man or a woman. But then, I do realize that when we go through rounds of interviews and all, we've hired a few candidates. I do notice that my two co-founders have a tendency to want to hire more women because they truly believe that, they want a different point of view when it comes to brainstorming, strategizing, and I really appreciate that, right? So I think they're a lot more aware than I am sometimes. Meanwhile, so we are trying to put in place a lot of the policies in our HR to basically, enable, female staff working here to have work-life balance, all the things about, having being there for your children, and also we're trying to inculcate a lot of that. So we are very guilty about, overworking ourselves, but we want to make the environment a lot more friendlier, for everybody, especially women with families and children. Because I myself have 2 young children myself, so we're quite aware. Yeah, so feminine leadership is what we practice, and not necessarily something that's exclusive to women. I think male leaders can practice that too, and a lot of them do. And my 2 co-founders, fortunately, do as well.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much. Yeah, some really, really great answers. So thank you very much for providing some insight into that. I wanted to address this question to Anandhi and Sumira. I think we've talked, or you guys have talked a lot about kind of what you look for in candidates and have been over the last year or so, or when you've been hiring. When Anandhi and Sumira, when you get involved in new opportunities and you look to get involved in new things, what key factors are you looking for in green tech startups, and then also potential leaders for those? Anandhi, if you want to go first.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think as a venture capital firm, ultimately we're looking for companies that are able to, find product market fit. I think for us that's very, very key. And the second is the stage at which we come in is usually once they've had some amount of commercial traction. So that's kind of a key metric that we want to see. Having said that, I think the other things are pretty similar to kind of anybody working in the startup and the VC ecosystem is, is there a market that's big enough, or is it too niche? Because very often that becomes a problem within the climate space, is that the market is just too small or is just not growing fast enough. And so I think that's another key part. In terms of the kind of people that we like to invest in and the founders that we work with, we do have a very extensive internal rubric that we use when we evaluate founders, when we make investments. We do a very thorough management assessment, and we think that's really important to kind of identify, the kind of people that we're going to be working with, and also the interpersonal relationships between founders, because they have a very long journey ahead of them, and it should be that they're able to work together through the tough and the good times, right? But I think if I were to highlight a few of the things that we look for, I think Jayantika and Leah, you kind of pointed this out. earlier as well. But grit, the tenacity and the perseverance is kind of the biggest one of them all, I think, because startup life is hard. We recognize that, and I think we have tremendous respect for founders who've kind of seen that that journey, right? I think the other part of it, I think Leah, you mentioned this, is the ability to set a vision and then execute on that vision, and then bring the team behind them to execute on that vision. I think that's also super important. I think it also speaks to the ability to be coached. Again, Leah, I think you mentioned this. One of the things that we recognize is no one's perfect, right? We all have flaws and we all have things that we can improve upon. But the open-mindedness of an individual to recognize that, there are areas that I could be better at and be willing to be coached through that, I think are also very important traits for a solid founder. Maybe just to add a couple of other things that I realized, that we always look for, irrespective of whether this is a clean tech company, but actually more importantly, because it's a clean tech company, because very often these are hardware-based solutions. They could be hardware-enabled software, they could be hardware as a service, but you're looking at fundamental industrial innovation, which not always can be solved with just software. And so when it comes to these kinds of companies, we're looking for solutions where there is a path to profitability. So the key questions that we end up asking are, what are the working capital needs? And what are the COGS like? And is there a path to bringing down those COGS? I think those are key factors in this clean tech space.
Amazing. And just before I move on to Sumira, I just wanted to quickly ask, actually, what is your, Anandhi, what is your long-term vision for the startup ecosystem? And how do you feel your role kind of shaping that ecosystem, I guess? Like, how do you see yourself making an impression in that ecosystem moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been, I would say I'm fairly new to the VC world, not new to the clean tech space. But one of the things that I've realized, especially in the clean tech VC world, is that it's a very collaborative community and a very helpful community. We, I think, all recognize that it takes a village to let these startups grow and succeed, and in the process, we all make money out of it, and we save, help solve some important problems for the world. And so I think this collaborative aspect of startups, accelerators, VCs, syndicates, right? We always syndicate when we make investments. And I think that is really one of the things that has stood out to me. If you look at other VC industries, more generic, kind of very typical D2C kind of businesses, you find it to be a lot more competitive, lot more cutthroat, maybe. But I think in general, the climate ecosystem is a lot more collaborative.
Thank you. Yeah, Sumira, and then back to the first question, and just to remind you, when looking for new opportunities to get involved in, what key factors are you looking for in green tech startups or their potential leaders?
Sure. So I think because we're a venture builder as well as a VC, our approach is slightly different. So when we look at opportunities, what we look at is a space really big enough to be 100 by 100? But also, I think we approach the sort of like climate issue from a different lens, right? When you see a lot of startups, and Anandhi has talked about this a little bit, is that you do see quite a lot of hardware, sort of very deep tech startups in this space, right? But I think where Wavemaker Impact is slightly different is that we believe that, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a lot of business model innovation that is still left to solve. So there are established technologies out there that are mature, and it's really just a unit economics problem to solve, right? So I think our approach is slightly different than when we look for opportunities, we really look for areas like this, right? For example, with the solar issue within Southeast Asia, how might we put solar panels on every roof in Southeast Asia, right? Like we try and solve big problems like this. So I think that's kind of how we look at different opportunities from the business model innovation lens. And in terms of the founders that we look for to sort of help us solve these problems, I have to say a lot of our criteria very much are like what Anandhi mentioned. Grit, determination, and maybe one additional factor here is that I think they need to have this sort of drive and ambition to sort of do something, sort of game changing. 100 by 100 as our mandate is an extremely ambitious goal, and it's not something that you can achieve in 1 or 2 years. It's a 5 to 7 year journey. It's a long lifetime to be a founder, and as Anandhi mentioned, it's some tough times. So is there a founder that really wants to leave this sort of legacy, really wants to have this kind of like really large scale impact? And I think these are the kind of founders that we're looking for. And maybe to answer the next question that you might ask, which is in terms of like where I see potential opportunities. I think what I've seen sort of in climate tech over the past year or 2 years is that there seems to be, especially within the Southeast Asia region, a lot of investment going into sort of transport, mobility, EVs. The reality of the situation is actually that's only responsible for about 13% of emissions in Southeast Asia, right? There are a lot of areas which also need to be decarbonized, and where there are opportunities with low-hanging fruit, right? An example of this is that for property developers, probably 80% of their emissions come from the construction materials that they buy in terms of cement and steel, right? There are viable alternatives to this that can help decarbonize 35% of this. Another opportunity is that across Southeast Asia, there's 48 million hectares of degraded land. Planting bamboo and using that bamboo as fabric as a replacement for polyester or cotton is already something that's a viable sort of commercial technology. But no one's really exploring these technologies, and they are effectively low-hanging fruit. So in terms of opportunities, I think what Wavemaker Impact really wants to focus on is, number one, business model innovation, but number two, sort of like looking at the other sectors, like the less sexy sectors where there's still some sort of low-hanging fruit left to decarbonize, and that's kind of our approach.
Cool, thank you so much. Anandhi, have you seen anything similar as well? Sumira obviously mentioned low-hanging fruit. Is there anything that you're seeing as well in that space?
Yeah, for me, I think, so I look very specifically at the energy sector, and I think we're seeing a trend of electrification of everything, right? Transportation, the electrons that we receive at home. But for me, the one that I'm quite excited about is industrial heat. So this is, think of any kind of manufacturing or process industry that requires heat for drying, cracking, smelting, whatever it is. Typically very high temperature, anywhere between a couple of 100 degrees centigrade and upwards of 1,000 degrees centigrade. And these have historically been considered, hard to abate, given that fossil fuels are cheap. So that was the input as the feedstock was very cheap. And the equipment to convert to electric, so think of boilers, pumps, and those kinds of things, were also much more affordable. I think two things have changed. One is electricity prices from renewables have come down dramatically. And secondly, the technology, I think for most of kind of low and medium heat requirements, electric versions of those equipment are already in market. So I think the time has come for that adoption. And also for the high temperature heat, we're seeing pretty elegant and creative solutions to, take electricity when it's cheap, store it in the form of heat, and then make use of it, directly as heat or steam or whatever else as the process demands. So I think that's a very exciting space. And the second space that I would call out is, we're talking about renewables, we're talking about distributed generation, which is basically rooftop solar and batteries, etc. But that has a huge impact on the grid itself and the infrastructure that we have. Historically, grid infrastructure has been a few very large generation assets, and all the power flows in one direction to our homes, to our businesses. And that is fundamentally changing. You're having, thousands of assets that can generate, much smaller, of course, but can generate power and send those electrons in all directions. And the grid is just not set up for that. So I think, technology to enhance the existing transmission capacity, which is a huge bottleneck. In Southeast Asia, for example, Vietnam has had one of the biggest challenges wherein they've had so much new solar installed, but that solar is not going anywhere because the transmission capacity doesn't exist. So I think addressing those bottlenecks through creative solutions like superconductors or other kinds of things, and software and IoT related solutions for utilities to better manage the distribution grids, because ultimately power is one of the key things that drives the economy, and so you have to have a resilient and reliable grid, and I think the infrastructure that's needed for these utilities to have the resources to do that will actually come from startups. So I'm actually very excited for that space as well.
Really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, it would be great to kind of maybe catch up in a few years' time and see the developments in the industry, or see if there's been any new companies that maybe you guys have invested in. And yeah, it would be great to see the developments over the next couple of years in these topics that you've mentioned. So yeah, thank you so much for that. This is open to anyone. What is kind of your most memorable achievement, whether it's personal or professional? And I will hand it over to you guys if anyone wants to start with that. Wini, Jay, anyone?
I think I'm a work in progress. Honestly, I'm doing this right now and hope this is the most memorable achievement. And I think the work never stops. I'm accused to be a workaholic and thinking of what's next, what's better ahead, how I can make things better. So I wouldn't say that like I'm satisfied that this is enough. Yeah. So there are much more avenues to achieve and much more paths to chart on.
So for me, I've done startups before, succeeded and failed. So this is not my first startup, but this is the first startup where I really have to do a lot more beyond what I'm capable of or I know of. So I think this is the first time I'm really stretched. Just a few months ago, I built my first lab for the researchers. What do I know about labs, right? Like nothing, but I've learned everything, and we managed to build this beautiful lab. I'm so proud of myself. 1 week I'm doing legal, next week I'm doing HR, and you're never too late to learn. And I feel like age 47, I'm like, hey, I can still do it. So I think working on Aprisium and starting this company has taught me a lot, and never stop learning, right? So this is my big continuing education. So and the next thing I'm embarking on, starting last week, was we're trying to get now the lab accredited. So I'm learning all about ISO now. So it's really interesting. So I think my personal achievement is that I get to learn nonstop and recognize that if I really try, I can do so much more.
That's really cool. Thank you. That kind of leads me on to my next question really well. Could you give, well, me and the audience and everyone listening, a quick insight into the exciting things that you've got planned for the rest of this year and beyond? This could be personal and professional. So yeah, please could you provide an insight into kind of anything that you have upcoming that we would love to know. Leah, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. And I'm glad you cut off after Wini, because I don't know how anyone would have topped her personal successes as a HR professional and building a lab and ISO certification. So yeah, hats off to how much you can learn when you put your mind and your heart into it. In terms of what's coming up for this year, I think there's a lot of work I think supply chains companies are just really, at least the players that we're working with, the clients we're working with as large multinationals, there's just now becoming a really strong focus on what supply chain, first of all, understanding where emissions are coming from in the supply chain, that it's increasingly becoming mandatory to start measuring, or it will be over the next few years, to start measuring emissions across the supply chain and disclosing those. And I think and engaging, starting to influence and shift those like through procurement teams or understanding where kind of what needs to happen. So the exciting opportunities there, and kind of circling back to some of those future technologies that are needed to get to a net zero world, but are still very nascent. The benefit of working in a kind of data-driven emissions inventory space is that you can start to work with companies to understand what technologies are needed in order to get on that trajectory. So it's really about transparency, and that opens up opportunities for demand aggregation. So if you're doing an inventory for a real estate company, and purchase goods and services in scope 3, and specifically cement is a hotspot, and then how much cement in 5 years will they need to buy from low carbon sources to get to halving emissions? And then taking that a step further, is the company willing to engage with some of the a contract that in 5 years they will buy this amount, and can they also work with competitors to the collaborative nature of sustainability? Could they aggregate with demand with and we start to see those timelines of future technologies actually coming forward, because there is that predictability around demand. So I think really galvanizing our role as Terrascope in being a software company that catalyzes change in those sectors, in those mobility and in energy and in the built environment, and definitely not seeing it as an either or. We need that change in those kind of systems, those physical systems. So I think the supply chain work is endless, and some really exciting innovations and kind of engagement happening over the course of this year. The transition planning space is huge. So all of this kind of rolls up into transition planning, and a key area that we're developing from a product analytics standpoint is the financial information overlay. So there's a lot happening in, for example, the carbon pricing and carbon tax space. The EU in a couple of years will have any of these. Right now it's 6 commodities, but it will be more, probably expanded. If you import them into the EU, at the border you have to pay a carbon tax. So how can we work with companies to already start thinking about this transition plan over the next 5 to 10 years, and what the financial implications if they weren't to, for example, start procuring more low carbon cement, or if other carbon taxes were rolled out. So the financial overlay information is important. We're seeing a lot of interest from, for example, ratings agencies to start getting more climate information from companies, because that right now there's a lot of gaps, and when there's gaps, your rating goes down. And so seeing how do we build an ecosystem of more accurate data, and that's what we specialize in through the data science machine learning, is faster and more accurate information. So those are exciting ones from a company, and kind of bringing it full circle to how we expand and our cultural growth. So we're aiming to double the number of employees this year, and so that's a huge kind of internal company growth. And I'm going to do a plug for who I'm hiring. So decarbonization specialists and climate regulation specialists. And what's also exciting is the kind of geographic expansion. So we've got the vast majority, most people here in Singapore, but we're looking at kind of across the EU as kind of a leader in the climate regulation space. Also, there's more opening up in Japan and Australia in a kind of hybrid and virtual working world. So a lot of opportunities for internal company growth. And what is really exciting is how many people join the space with a mission, and bringing together really robust tech backgrounds. People are coming from, former Twitter, former Google. So, and then applying that. For me, having been in the sustainability and climate space for my 10-year career, now seeing the types of different skill sets entering to solve the problem brings me a lot of hope that we're going to start seeing global emissions declining, and some of these really niche technologies becoming much more mainstream. And we'll soon this will be the norm, and we won't be climate or green tech, we'll just be tech, and the world will be shifting. So that's really the vision we're kind of working towards in Terrascope. Thanks.
Amazing. Jay, I don't know if you want to go next, if you've got any exciting plans coming up this year.
Yeah, thanks. Leah spoke quite a bit about the overall carbon emission space, and that's definitely fascinating. We're working on a small sector of it, like Scope 2, basically helping you reduce your Scope 2 emissions on day-to-day basis. So given the rise of prices of electricity in the region, as well as the push towards sustainability, has put us in a slightly favorable position to where our solution probably sits, provides continuous energy savings and thus cost savings to businesses, which hits both the targets of sustainability goals as well as reducing cost in this volatile market. Um, I think the exciting stuff for us that's upcoming is definitely we want to grow primarily sticking to the region that we have, which is Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia. And we are probably going to be expanding into the UAE because these are like very energy guzzling um, sectors, a lot of developing urban environment where these solutions probably fit in. On the tech perspective, I think Anandhi touched on it a bit, like about the problems for the grid that the distributed energy brings to the table. So we are starting from ground up, creating a value for the stakeholders who own these kind of assets. So building owners own their HVAC system, they own the solar on their rooftop, and probably any kind of battery infrastructure or EV charging inside their basement. So we are creating a value for the stakeholder while also preparing the grid for the future, which is like driven by virtual power plants, which are not power plants situated like in Jurong Island, but actually are distributed across CBD as well. So that is the goal that we are working towards of creating an internetwork systems, which is a slightly longer term goal for us at Resync, like because it's not you solve this problem in a few months or even a year is not enough because the complexity and the nature of this problem. So while we are continuing to grow our businesses and creating values for the stakeholder and building our credibility in different markets, our aim would be to tie it all together with the virtual power plant goal down the path. And I think one of the key areas that's like really exciting for me in the company, again, as like Leah, I'm going to do a plug. We are hiring for certain key positions. We are not hiring as aggressively as Terrascope right now, but hiring for certain key positions, which are like market expansions, business development, as well as part of our engineering and product teams. So we'll be expanding primarily in Singapore, also looking at remotely. We have an entity in India, so hiring under that, as well as Indonesia, to keep the market, to keep our cost competitive, and making sure we get the best talents out of these emerging markets as well. Yeah, thank you.
Sumira, if you want to go next.
Yeah. I think in terms of what I'm excited for is that for Wavemaker Impact specifically, we've just managed to close our first fund, which means this year our big aim is to launch 6 companies. And we've basically found founders for 3 of them, but 3 other founders we're still looking for. So again, like everyone's plugging, another plug of my own, basically to if you're a founder, who's interested in solving this big 100 by 100 problem that we're all facing, I think please get in touch. Happy to have any and all chats. And I think from a geographic basis, I think the majority of our operations are here based in Southeast Asia, with a Southeast Asia focus, but with a global aim. But we are also launching some businesses. The aim is to do those in Australia as well as New Zealand. So we're looking at the APAC region as a whole. So I think that's what we're most excited for 2023. Happy to pass it on.
Wini, maybe for you.
Sure. So it's going to be a great year for us. I can feel it and know it. This year we have a few opportunities to be part of the beautiful storytelling of some future cities project around the world. So, sustainable city, future cities are happening a lot in India, China, Indonesia. So we have a lot of opportunities to go in there and be part of that beautiful storytelling. And also we're entering new industries this year. So we are not in EV battery manufacturing and mining. related to EV. So we're talking about things like lithium, cobalt, manganese. So these are all new big industries that's popping up. So with strategic partners, so now we are entering these markets whereby we will help them to manage on-site contamination detection on a continuous basis. So instead of them sending samples to the lab and wait. Right, so that's the, and we want to be part of the storytelling about how, you know, these now Europe has discovered some of the largest rare earth mines now. And of course, in Europe, they're in the most pristine areas. It's beautiful mountains, valleys, and rivers and lakes, right? So we want to be part of that storytelling whereby, you know, the environment is protected. We want to be the ones that's helping all the governments and corporates, you know, adhere to or address the concerns when it comes to 7 out of 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals when it comes to public health and environmental health and safety. So I think this year is going to be a great year for us in terms of coming out with a lot of beautiful use cases that truly makes a difference.
Anandhi, your last.
Yeah. You know, when I was interviewing for Emerald, and I was speaking to one of the interviewers, and he said, you know, once you join Emerald, any dull day is your own doing. And it's so true, you know. We have the luxury of being in a position where we get to get inspired by entrepreneurs on a daily basis. And so I think in terms of what we have ahead for 2023, our fund is growing pretty fast. We actually work with a lot of corporates who join us as innovation partners. And I think with that comes also you know, more deployments. One thing that I have as a personal goal, and I think our team here in Singapore, so we're actually a global organization. We have teams across Zurich, Toronto, and here in Singapore. But I think one of the things that we as a team here have is a goal to hopefully invest in our first company out of this part of the world, and hopefully Singapore. So yeah, if you know, like everybody else, if you have startups and you're looking for funding, please do reach out to us.
Amazing. We have a couple of minutes, and I just wanted to ask kind of a final question. We're obviously all based in APAC, but we have a lot of people and a lot of listeners today that are across the world. You kind of mentioned expansion, and Andy, you just mentioned Toronto. Are you seeing a particular shift outside of APAC? You know, are you seeing growth, expansion, or, you know, a specific region where you can see a bit of market development over the next few years? And Andy, I don't know, potentially as you're a global fund, if you're seeing anything, if you want to answer first.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, what we've seen is that there's a lot of activity in sort of the, I would say, in the industrial innovation space in this part of the world, almost as much as, say, Europe. However, it's the stage of the companies that are a lot more earlier. I think that's partly because of the sector we're talking about. It's oftentimes, you know, B2B businesses, sales cycles are longer, and I think the time it takes for businesses in this part of the world, or perhaps the pressure isn't still on yet. So the ultimate end user, and so you know, we're just starting to see that the scale and that inflection point for some of these companies. So I'd say in general, my observation has been much earlier stage companies in South and Southeast Asia when we compare to their, you know, European and North American counterparts. I think it's also a great opportunity though for people who want to build a business. The time is right.
I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to add with that.
From the carbon accounting space and kind of demand, the demand for needing more granular and accurate information on scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, it's really been driven to date by the regulations, and I think one of the roles and the kind of engagements we do with Terrascope is contributing to those public consultation processes. And it's really amazing how much and how fast the climate regulation space is changing, and that push. So there's kind of draft standards in Europe for a climate disclosure, and that talks a lot about transition planning and getting much more granular data, especially on Scope 3. We're looking at Australia's just finishing their consultation process on mandatory climate disclosures. We have it in Singapore, and all of these are based on the kind of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And so I think that I think the demand for climate emissions data has been incubated in the EU and the US, and we're seeing like a really strong global push out to the point where actually it was interesting that the Australian climate disclosure paper from the Treasury was like, we know Australia is lagging a little bit behind. We think we're going to be at a disadvantage if we don't do this. So we wanted to get your thoughts as companies on like what we should be asking for transparency and disclosure purposes. And so really like the global baseline is shifting. And so I think there's still maybe growing awareness of companies that haven't done their first greenhouse gas emission inventory. Like just getting that started there's kind of a bit of, just delay in terms of that change management, getting on that process. Who's going to be responsible for getting the supplier data, getting the activity data, putting it into the platform? And so that first, it's really interesting working with companies doing emissions inventories for their first time. And now we're seeing kind of the other key driver is consumer demand. There's maybe less so Southeast Asia for now, but that can be a driving force for where it's coming from. So and then the trade relations are if rules change in one relation and you have global supply chains, then you have to start thinking about how is that going to influence me now, today, and over the coming years. And I think from the regulator standpoint, like investors really care about this, and they're thinking that if maybe the investors on this call can correct me, but but that what if I set a target for my portfolio emissions, and what happens over the next couple years if the companies don't start to shift emissions. Although I think that we're safe with the climate tech investors on this call, but your heavier emissions sectors where there is a lot of transition risk, and so the growth is pretty phenomenal in the demand for getting more granular emissions, and I think what that means for being able to do more specific climate plans is exciting. So there's a huge amount of growth in the space, and certainly in Southeast Asia, in those real economy sectors like agriculture, food and beverages that we're seeing.
Amazing. If no one has anything else to add, I would like to say thank you so much for attending. I can say on behalf of all of our listeners, who I'm sure will send in some further questions and emails to us. But yeah, thank you so much. It's been really great to have you all. I know you're all very, very busy as well, doing amazing things. So really excited to see some of the things that everyone achieves in your companies and what you're investing in. So thank you very much. We will put together an ebook. So any further questions that the listeners have put in, we will make sure that everything gets answered, and we'll be producing an ebook with everything that's been discussed today on our webinar as well. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you all to our listeners as well. It's been great to have you. And yes, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Storm4 for
Thank you.
hosting.